The C-SPAN networks bring you long-form public affairs programming from the nation's capital and are a public service of your television provider. C-SPAN, created by cable. This week on Q&A, journalist, playwright, and author George Packer discusses his latest book titled The Unwinding, An Inner History of the New America.
George Packer, when you look at the cover of your book, The Unwinding, what's the purpose of the flag we see?
That's actually a photograph of the side of a van parked in somebody's front yard in rural Virginia. A photographer happened to be walking past and noticed that the flag painted on this white van was starting to rust and thought it was a striking image and asked the owner if he could take a picture. And it's a piece of folk art. And the book comes out of the heartland in many ways. It comes out of the experiences of ordinary Americans in places like rural Virginia. And it's a flag that is in somewhat battered shape, but it's still the flag. So I thought it was the perfect image for The Unwinding.
When did you decide on the title and why?
I was visiting the homestead of R.J. Reynolds, speaking of rural Virginia, with Dean Price, who's one of the main characters in the book. And we were standing there looking at all the fallow farmland in that part of the country that used to be tobacco farms. And he was imagining a future in which all of this fallow land would be rejuvenated for the purpose of making alternative energy, alternative fuels out of canola and soy and other crops. And he said there could be an unwinding where we go back to something more like the 19th century, with each town and each homestead making its own food and its own energy as happened before the industrial age. And that word, the unwinding, which I'd never heard in that context, stuck with me. Dean Price is an incredibly eloquent voice. But what it said to me was something more about the present than the future. It resonated with my sense that things that used to hold America together, structures, institutions, social ties, have frayed, have begun to come undone. And that is the underlying theme of the whole book. And that phrase, the unwinding, seemed like enough of a nuanced, resonant phrase. It doesn't tell you exactly what to think. And this book is not a policy book. It is not a polemical book. It does not tell you the 10 things wrong with America and how to fix them. It's more like a novel in nonfiction form, and I needed a title that had some poetry to it and some evocativeness.
You remember the day or the moment you got the idea to do this kind of a book?
If I had to pinpoint it, it was when I was in Baghdad covering the war for the New Yorker, and with my friend Dexter Filkins, who was then with the New York Times, now with the New Yorker. And we were looking at a couple of contractors sauntering out of a green zone cafe after eating cheeseburgers, and he turned to me and said, "You know, we're just not that good anymore." And it really struck me with full force. I knew exactly what he meant, but I didn't know how or why it had happened. Why couldn't we rebuild Iraq? What was it about not just our leaders, but our institutions that seemed to keep failing there? And then at home, when I got back from the war and covered the 2008 election, every domestic institution that we had all counted on, from commercial banks to investment banks to auto manufacturers, seemed to be in a state of collapse. And that's when I thought, there is a big story about a generation-long process of corrosion of our institutions, the institutions that used to support the aspirations of ordinary people like Dean Price, and that no longer really work, so that people feel more and more alone. Now, this is a big subject, and it doesn't come to you all at once, but it really began for me when I was in Baghdad watching Iraq implode.
What year was that?
I was there every year from 2003 to 2007. I think that moment was probably around 2006, when things were getting close to the rock bottom.
The structure of the book, you have three main characters: Dean Price, Jeff Connaughton, and Tammy Thomas.
Yep.
How did you select them? Take Dean Price.
I ran across him by accident. I hadn't yet really figured out the book. Wasn't looking for someone like him. I was writing another piece about Congressman Tom Perriello, who had a short but interesting career in Congress, elected in 2008, defeated in 2010 from Southern Virginia. His office introduced me to this guy who had America's first biodiesel truck stop. That was its claim to fame in Martinsville, Virginia. And 30 seconds on the phone with the proprietor, Dean Price, was enough to convince me to go down there and not just interview him, but go down repeatedly, stay at his house, get to know his family, see his life, drive around North Carolina, which is where his home is, just south of the state line. And he struck me as a completely American type, entrepreneurial, connected to the land, a believer in farming, but also kind of a visionary with a lot of ideas knocking around in his head. And he had to be willing to let me intrude on him to that extent, which he was. So Dean Price became the first person who I thought, this is a big enough story, a man who's got a chain of truck stops that's failed, and in a region that's failing. Tobacco, textiles have abandoned, have gone. There's not much left. And he sees a kind of rebirth of the land in biofuels, in biodiesel, and that's what he's done. He's become like a Johnny Appleseed, spreading the word around North Carolina for biofuels, and so that struck me as a big enough story that it could go into a book.
How old is he today, and where does he live, and how's he doing?
I think he just turned 50, and I know how that feels. He still lives in Stokesdale, North Carolina. Just north of Greensboro, on that US 220 where all his truck stops used to be. He's had unbelievable setbacks: personal bankruptcy, business bankruptcy, just really dark times when it seemed like his biodiesel project was going to fail. His partnership dissolved, but he keeps coming back in this resilient, never quit way, and he is now trying to get school systems around North Carolina, county by county, to use waste restaurant oil that he collects in all the fast food joints and barbecue restaurants around North Carolina to make biodiesel for their school buses, to save money, and it's good for the environment. It's a win-win-win, as Dean likes to say, and that's what he's doing. And it's still, very hard, but he has not quit, and it's an inspirational story for that reason.
How did you find Tammy Thomas, and who is she?
Tammy Thomas is a black woman in Youngstown, Ohio. She's lived her whole life in Youngstown, and her life has coincided with the collapse of Youngstown. It was a big steelmaking city. And then starting in '77, 5 years with breathtaking speed, the entire steel industry left Youngstown, leaving 50,000 jobs taken away from a rather small community. She grew up the daughter of a heroin addict, and she cared for her mother in a way more than her mother was able to care for her. She told me the story of trying to stay awake as a little girl while her mother would smoke in bed so that she could wait for her mother to fall asleep and then take the cigarette out of her hand and put it out. She was really raised by her great-grandmother, who took her to work where the great-grandmother cleaned the houses of rich white people in Youngstown, the steel barons. And Tammy developed this sort of tenacity and a sense of wanting to prove people wrong who doubted her. And she got pregnant at 15, and her granny cried and said, you've broken my heart. And Tammy just was determined that this would not be the end of her education. She graduated from high school, raised 3 kids by herself, holding down one of the last good blue-collar jobs in Youngstown, working at a GM auto parts factory. And for almost 20 years, she was on the assembly line, just doing the same thing day after day. And then just when she was getting close to retirement, the company declared bankruptcy and took almost all of its American jobs to Mexico. And that was the end of one part of Tammy's life.
How old is she today, and what is she doing today?
So I think she is now 47. All the characters in the book are of a roughly 10-year age cohort, born in the late 50s to the late 60s, because the Unwinding covers this past generation from the late 70s to the present. So I wanted characters whose adult lives coincided with that period. She's still in Youngstown, but she's now a community organizer. That's what she remade herself into after losing the assembly line job, trying to empower her fellow Youngstown residents who've hung on there while the city has really been in a death spiral, to get things like vacant houses torn down by the city, to get better grocery stores around the city, just basic things of life.
How'd you find her?
Unlike Dean Price, I was looking for someone like her. I wanted to find a woman in the Rust Belt. I wanted a woman as a main character of the book. I wanted someone from the Rust Belt, because deindustrialization has been one of the biggest and most painful occurrences of this past generation. So asking people who knew Ohio, who knew the industrial Midwest, I suddenly came upon this name, Tammy Thomas, and she was not quite so quick to take me up as Dean Price was, but over a long period of visits to Youngstown, I got to know her, and she would drive me around the east side where she grew up and said, that used to be my elementary school. That was my mother's house. That was a peach orchard. All gone.
Jeff Connaughton.
Jeff Connaughton was a source of mine on a New Yorker story about insider trading on Wall Street. And as soon as I heard the rough outlines of his biography, I felt I wanted him to be in my book, because he is a career Washington insider. And you can't write about what's happened to America over the past generation without taking Washington into account. When he was an undergraduate at the University of Alabama, he heard a young senator named Joe Biden give a speech, which was a dazzling speech, and he attached his ambitions to Joe Biden and told Biden, if you run for president, I'll be there with you. He thought he would ride that horse to the White House. And he was involved in Biden's '88 campaign, which ended badly in a certain scandal. And over the years, Connaughton continued to work for Biden, but was increasingly disillusioned. Biden was not, to say the least, a nurturing boss. It turned into a kind of transactional Washington relationship, where it all was up to what was in it for me. Connaughton eventually left government service and became a lobbyist, and that's part of why I was interested in him, because the revolving door is such a basic part of what it means to be in Washington. He made a lot of money with a very prominent lobbying firm here in Washington during the boom of lobbying over the past 15 years, and then lost a lot of that money in the financial crisis of 2008, which is kind of a reckoning, a watershed event for all the characters in the book. He came back into government as the chief of staff to the senator who replaced Biden, Ted Kaufman of Delaware. And for 2 years, Kaufman and Connaughton made it their mission to impose serious reform on Wall Street coming out of the financial crisis, to try to reinstate something close to Glass-Steagall and to break up the banks if they got beyond a certain size. And none of that came to pass, but there was a lot of integrity in the fight. And in the end, Connaughton, who's now just over 50, decided he'd had enough of Washington, and he proceeded to burn every bridge he had to this city by telling his story in his own memoir and to me. And now he lives in Savannah, Georgia.
The structure of this book, I counted 10 side characters. They're not characters so much as, well, mostly well-known people, and you give about 5 or 6 pages to them. Oprah Winfrey, Sam Walton, Colin Powell, Alice Walters,
Jay-Z,
Bob Rubin, Raymond Carver,
Newt Gingrich,
Elizabeth Warren. Why? What's that supposed to be?
Right. So the structure of the book was very difficult for me to come up with, but it was crucial that I get it right. to tell the story of America over a generation in a really panoramic way, but also intimately, I needed these main characters who we've been talking about, but I also needed to show what was happening at the top of society among the VIPs, the celebrities, who were influencing different parts of our culture. So from politics, there's Newt Gingrich, who I think maybe more than any other single figure created the rather toxic atmosphere of politics that we're now so used to in America.
Let me interrupt because I got a little bit of video I want to show you. Found this moment, not this specific moment, but the idea in your book, and get you to comment on this.
I did two things. I through speech money, I helped pay a donation for conservation, which is what the National Zoo asked for. They're on permanent loan, I think. And secondly, they'll grow to be much, much bigger, about 10 feet long. The second thing was we had a local corporation, First Financial, loaned the plane, which came to Washington, a private corporate jet, came to Washington, and I went out to fly down with the two dragons. I thought this is going to be one of the really highlights of my career. And they were in the kind of bags you'd carry sneakers in. They were much younger than this, and what they had done is they had taken the dragon, which was about 18 inches long at that time, and put them in a cheesecloth bag, tied the bag shut, so they could breathe through this cheesecloth, but it was dark, so they thought it was asleep. They're trying to go to sleep. Dropped them in this one each in these two bags, zipped them up. I think they were Nike or Reebok bags. And I arrive, and the guy said, "Here, you carry yours." And I'm sitting there carrying a Komodo monitor or a Komodo dragon. And then we got them down here, and they took them out. They're very, very strong.
That is 1994, December, right before he became speaker at the Atlanta Zoo. What's the relevance of that, the zoo thing with Newt Gingrich?
I mean, that reminds me of the Newt Gingrich of when he was 8 or 9 years old, when he went to the, when he was just fascinated by animals, by dinosaurs. He took a bus by himself from his hometown to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, when he was about 10 years old, and went to see a safari double feature, and came out of it wondering why there was no zoo in Harrisburg, and went to the Parks Department on his own and found the relevant official and said, I think there should be a zoo. And that made the front page of the local paper. And you can see his boyish enthusiasm in that clip. There's other sides to Gingrich that are a little darker, and there's a line in my portrait of him, and there are these 10 celebrity portraits, each of them based on their own writings, their own work, their own language. In the piece on Gingrich, I say that he was so grown up at 9, the boy who would grow up to seem 9 years old at 50 seemed 50 years old at 9. There's that famous, I think, New York Daily News crybaby front page of Gingrich. There was something out of control about him. He said whatever came to mind. He was volatile. He, was hugely ambitious and didn't try to conceal it. And he was a rock thrower. I mean, he came to Congress in '78, which is around the time the book begins, not to build up the institution, but to tear it down and to rebuild the Republican Party from the rubble. And he did that. I mean, he succeeded really beyond any expectation, but it was at a great cost. He used C-SPAN brilliantly. C-SPAN came to Congress the year Gingrich came to Congress, and he performed for the cameras and developed a following across the country and kind of his own base, and used the cameras to start to do damage to Tip O'Neill and to the Democrats, and eventually became Speaker. But he became Speaker of an institution that had been so polarized by tactics like his that it ended up consuming him, like Robespierre in the French Revolution. So that's why Gingrich is in the book as kind of a signature representative of the world of politics.
Here's some video of a man named Robert Rubin. We'll watch a little bit of it. You talk about this particular incident in your book with Phil Angelides. Let's watch.
I don't know that you can have it two ways. You either were pulling the levers or asleep at the switch. And I think this is about, as we try to recover from this calamity, I'm not so sure apologies are important as assessment of responsibility. and that is the following. You are not a garden variety board member. You are chairman of the executive committee, and you can characterize it, but to someone, I think to most people, chairman of the executive committee of the board of directors implies leadership. Certainly $15 million a year guaranteed implies leadership and responsibility. Mr. Rubin assumed responsibility, said it was the honorable thing. And I just think Mr. Prince, when he resigned, said it was the honorable thing to do. And my point is, I think that leadership and responsibility matters.
I agree with that, but if I may say so, Mr. Chairman, the executive committee is really misconstrued in that comment. The executive committee was a formal administrative apparatus of the institution. It had nothing to do with one's role in the function of the institution. I did feel in '07, because of all the problems, well, actually it wasn't because of all the problems that developed. I did feel in '07 that I should not get a bonus, but the reason was not the reasons that you're alluding to.
First of all, that's the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, and the chairman's a Democrat, Phil Angelides from California.
And Rubin is a Democrat.
Rubin is a Democrat. Unwind that, why you put that in your book.
Well, Rubin comes from the world of finance as well as government. And I see him as this very talented and much admired and in many ways very successful figure in both worlds, who didn't understand that the Wall Street that was his career was becoming a more and more corrupt and rotten institution in the last years he was there when he was at Citigroup. And that the interests of Wall Street and the country, which he had always thought could be harmonized, especially when he was in the Clinton White House and Treasury Department, were actually pulling in opposite directions. They were opposed to each other. He didn't see that. And in that clip, what you sense is a man who just cannot grapple with the extent to which the world that made him and where he thrived and succeeded wildly was no longer a productive or an ethical or a part of society that added value to Americans. It had taken value away from Americans, and he couldn't face that. So there's a certain pride in him that I think is disguised a bit by his humility. He's always self-effacing, but beneath that there's a real pride that would not say I was responsible. And even Alan Greenspan said I was responsible.
We'll go back to that clip again. Phil Angelides talking about the $15 million that he made every year. This is after he was in government?
Yes.
He was in what job at that point?
He was the chairman of the executive committee of Citigroup, which is this vague term, and he's trying to claim that it's actually a relatively insignificant position that had no day-to-day responsibility. Well, it may not have, but he was certainly in a powerful oversight position, and his voice, his judgment was so important to Sandy Weill that he was willing to pay him an enormous sum just to have Rubin on hand. But it turns out maybe Rubin wasn't paying much attention while Citigroup was making billions of dollars in collateralized debt obligations that were going to blow up and that some people could see were going to blow up. Maybe Rubin was a little out of touch, but to me that's just as damning as to say he was the guy with his hand on the lever. As Angelides said, hand on the lever or asleep at the switch. Neither is a good thing to have been.
Go back to where Robert Rubin worked before he came into government as a Secretary of the Treasury.
So he was at Goldman Sachs throughout his career from the 60s until Clinton made him first head of the National Economic Council and then Secretary of the Treasury. And during his years at Goldman Sachs, and he rose from being newly hired to being one of two co-chairmen. He presided over the huge growth in the wealth and power of Goldman, in its role in derivatives trading, fixed income, and other areas that seemed like huge growth areas and were, but also had these bombs ticking away inside them that maybe weren't as evident at the time. And he was also a Democrat, so he was part of what brought the Democratic Party and Wall Street closer together in the 80s. Part of the story of the book is how, as manufacturing disappeared from places like Youngstown, it was replaced by financial services. That and Silicon Valley were the two engines of wealth in the country, but they did not create broad wealth. They enriched a few people a lot and more people somewhat, and left most Americans sort of out of the deal. But for Rubin, Wall Street and Washington, should work together, and he brought the Democratic Party closer to Wall Street. And I think, in the end, it led to many Americans saying, "What's the difference between the two parties if they both are so dependent on the big money coming from either Wall Street or corporations," which is the world that Jeff Connaughton came of age in and had his career in.
Another man you write about is Sam Walton. Before we look at the clip, who is he? Was he?
A little bit like Dean Price, Sam Walton is from a small town in the heartland and had a dream of being a store owner and an owner of chain stores, and eventually built Walmart into the world's biggest retail empire. He's in the book as a representative of the world of business, and a particular kind of business, which is more and more what America has become as manufacturing has declined. And that decline is partly because Walmart pushed prices down to a point where American manufacturers could not meet its demands, and Walmart, turned to China for its products, and American manufacturers outsourced their work. So Walmart is, it's an economy in which wages and prices are low. It's a consumer economy. It's a sort of a cheap economy, and it's more and more the economy of small towns around the country, like the ones that Dean Price and Sam Walton grew up in. Dean Price, trying to make a go of it as an entrepreneur owning truck stops, was in direct competition with Walmart and found that he just couldn't compete. And the big box stores were essentially laying waste to main streets in the little towns of the Carolina Piedmont where Dean Price grew up.
Now explain this from your book, and I'll say it, then you can correct it if it's not right, that 6 Waltons today are worth 30% of the American people.
The bottom 30%.
6 Waltons. Did they participate at all in building the Walmart company?
They had the great good luck of being his heirs, but he built the company. And it's interesting that in his story, until his death in 1992, Walmart was mainly seen as a great American success story. This guy who started out in Bentonville, Arkansas, and became the wealthiest man in America.
Hillary Clinton was on his board, you said.
She was. And presidents and governors and business titans would go to Little Bentonville to pay homage to Sam Walton. He was a kind of a king, but a cheap king who still had a $5 haircut and didn't tip the barber. And that was kind of a story of homespun success until he died. And then the media coverage of Walmart shifted, as if without this folksy hero as its public face, suddenly people began to see that Walmart was actually killing off the character of all these small towns, and it was putting drugstore owners and shoe store owners on Main Street out of business. And as Dean Price once said to me, those weren't just the store owners, they were the pillars of the community. They were the Little League coaches, they were the Rotary Club presidents, city councilmen, and when they lost their business, the town lost something essential in its foundation. So Walmart without Sam Walton sort of began to look more like a sinister turn in the American economy, where we had fewer and fewer decent factory jobs and more store greeters. There's a family toward the end of the book in Tampa, which is one of the main locations of the book, whose whole world is dominated by Walmart. They're very poor. They buy their pharmaceuticals, their food, their clothing, everything at Walmart. And the father is trying to support a family of 4 as a produce stalker at $8.50 an hour for 20 hours a week because there's no full-time work. And Walmart is like it's the company that owns them, and they can't get out from it even though they resent it. And so there's a dark side to Sam Walton's story.
How did you pick the 10? Oprah Winfrey, Sam Walton, Colin Powell, Alice Walters, Bob Rubin, Raymond Carver, Newt Gingrich, Jay-Z, and Elizabeth Warren.
For different reasons. First of all, I wanted a kind of representative look at American life. So I needed politics, business, entertainment, food, finance, art. I also was interested in this recurring pattern, which you see with Gingrich, you see with Oprah, you see with Jay-Z, you see with Sam Walton, people who really begin in very humble places and are not unlike the main characters, Dean, Tammy, but who sort of reinvent themselves as something new and find a new language and a new idea that is riveting to Americans. And through that, they build an empire. And they can't stop building it. There's almost like an imperative, like with a corporation. You have to keep growing. Even as a person, as a brand, you have to keep growing. But eventually, a sort of decadence sets in, where the language becomes a kind of parody of itself. And they no longer seem to be producing something good. They just continue to produce. Gingrich just keeps writing book after book. Oprah, is on the cover of every issue of her magazine. And so they become the celebrities that we are now familiar with, who are just dominate our imaginations and in a way have come to replace the institutions that have faltered in this period of time. So I chose them for that reason, but there are also a couple of celebrities who I chose because I wanted to show that you can still do good work without getting caught up in the mania of celebrity. And Raymond Carver, the short story writer, who, short story is like the least remunerative field of literature. He had a huge influence on writers and on the culture and on readers because he just crafted these brilliant, truthful stories about America in this time.
Is he alive?
He died in 1988. He had a very tumultuous and difficult life. Alcoholic, wrote about that quite a bit. The last 10 years of his life, he managed to get sober and to be very productive. But just if you turn to his stories and you open them, start reading, there's this spareness of the language. It's quite haunting. It seems very ordinary, and yet there's something strange about it. And what he evokes for me is that in this period that he was writing in the 60s, 70s, 80s, but he was sort of projecting ahead. There was a loneliness, an isolation to his characters. They're not connected to anything. There are no institutions. Politics doesn't exist. Foreign countries don't exist. There's just, the Safeway and the bingo hall. That's pretty much what they've got. And that loneliness is very apropos, I think, of the way a lot of Americans live today. And in my book, most of the characters live alone.
This is a small item. I read your galley proofs, which we get a couple months in advance before the book comes out, and missing in this was the chapter on Andrew Breitbart. I just want to know why it was missing from here.
I ran out of gas. I was racing to make my deadline in December. I was sick at the time. It was really hard to finish this book. We have 2 small kids. I found this book extremely difficult to complete, and I just couldn't get Breitbart done before the book had to go off for galleys, the manuscript. But I knew Breitbart had to be in there because if I'm writing about the undoing of our institutions, media is essential, and Breitbart to me is a perfect story of how with old media losing faith in itself and losing its revenue and kind of just losing its hold on people, you have this sort of this charlatan charmer who knew how to use the internet to get a lot of attention and who had a very polarizing approach, but mainly just he knew how to get attention and he knew how to spook the old media and to sort of get inside its head. His story, of coming out of nowhere in LA and becoming this sort of major figure in new media seemed like it had to be in the book.
Died of heart attack at 43?
Yeah, he was quite young, just a few years ago.
You say that he was adopted?
Yes.
By a Jewish father and a Christian mother.
I don't know if the mother was Christian. I think they were both Jewish. I'm not certain. But he was, I think his ancestry, his biological ancestry was Irish. He was adopted when he was just a few weeks old. And I tell his story intercut with sort of the rise and fall of the golden age of old media. You know, when he's born and adopted, Walter Cronkite is in 1 out of every 5 households. When he's a toddler, Woodward and Bernstein are beginning to dig up the Watergate scandal, etc. But as he comes of age, cable news rises up, talking heads on cable news, shouting heads on cable news, the internet, blogging, Twitter, all of this transforms the landscape, and he is sort of perfectly positioned, you know, to stride into this landscape that's been denuded of all the old, you know, Time magazine, CBS News, and to just sort of say, I am here. You better listen to me.
What does it mean that he was a liberal turned conservative, worked for Drudge and Arianna Huffington, who was a conservative turned liberal? Does that have any metaphor for the society?
I think what it shows is that the loudest voices and the ones that have sort of gained the most attention are polarizing voices. And I think he could have gone either way. He could have ended up as a raving lefty. What mattered was, look at me, listen to me. And he knew how to get attention. He had a real flair for digging up scandal and blowing it out of its own boundaries, out of proportion, and getting the media to pay attention, almost by saying, you know, your refusal to pay attention to me proves your bias against my point of view. And the media would get spooked and say, yes, we will cover you.
How long have you worked for The New Yorker?
10 years.
How many books have you written?
I've written 2 novels and 5 books of nonfiction and 1 play.
How many copies of Assassin's Gate sold?
You know, I think it was about 100,000, but I'm not absolutely certain. And in general, I've tried to avoid knowing too much about my sales because usually it's so discouraging that it might prevent me from writing another book. I'm happy to say The Unwinding is selling quite well and is on the bestseller list, but that is quite an unusual thing in my life.
We were talking about Jeff Connaughton earlier, worked for Joe Biden. Here's a clip of him appearing on one of our call-in shows in the morning, and this was around the impeachment issue. Would he have been working?
He had gone to the Clinton White House, the counsel's office, and then just before impeachment began, he left and became a lawyer and lobbyist.
Here he is at that time.
If you're going to impeach a president, there has to be a consensus in the country among lawyers, among constitutional scholars, among the public, and eventually among the House members themselves, a bipartisan consensus that there is a strong case for his impeachment. And I think it's been clear for weeks now that there is no such consensus. There certainly isn't that consensus among constitutional scholars. More than 400 constitutional scholars have written the House Judiciary Committee saying that even if the president did make false statements under oath about a sexual relationship, that simply does not rise to the level of an impeachable offense.
How much time did you spend with him?
We had a long correspondence, and I had to convince him to let me write his story because he also was writing his own story in a book called The Payoff. And eventually I went down and stayed with him in Savannah for most of a week and spent many hours hearing the story of his life, including that period when he was out of government, but he really admired Clinton. He thought Clinton was in it for all the right reasons. He cared about ordinary Americans, and so he stuck his neck out on cable news and on C-SPAN on behalf of Clinton.
In the end, what did he think about Joe Biden?
I think he admires Biden for some of his ideas, for his talents as a politician. He thinks Biden is fantastically talented, but I also think he was deeply disillusioned and disappointed. There were a few moments in Connaughton's career when all Biden needed to do was pick up the phone and call someone and say, Jeff Connaughton's a good guy, and it would have made a huge difference to Connaughton, and Biden wouldn't do it. And it was as if, you know, Connaughton just hadn't joined the charmed inner circle that made you such a Biden loyalist that Biden was going to lift a finger for you. And it showed Connaughton that, you know, in Washington there really is something kind of cruelly transactional about relationships.
One of the things you learned from what he told you, and I didn't read his book, so I don't know, but the Biden language that he uses off camera is rather strong.
He could be, he could actually be quite rough on his aides, even humiliating. And this is all 25 years ago, and I don't know if that's the way Vice President Biden is. I haven't heard anything to suggest that it is, but it does suggest that, something about Biden that's interesting in Connaughton's story is that there's something incorruptible about him. He hates raising money. He hates doing favors for people who have helped him raise money. And so he won't play the K Street game to the extent that a lot of his colleagues in the Senate were happy to do. He would get on the train and go back to Wilmington every night. And because Connaughton was a fundraiser for Biden, it was almost as if Connaughton was punished for helping Joe Biden, raise money for his reelection, which of course was essential. So he was both incorruptible and ungrateful, which is a strange combination of things.
But in your book, you cite an incident that happened in 1987 that our cameras caught. And I want to show you this. It's not very long, and put this into context.
And the other question is, could you quickly, I think I
probably have a much higher IQ than you do, I suspect. I went to law school on a full academic scholarship, the only one in my class to have a full academic scholarship. In the first year in law school, I decided I didn't want to be in law school and ended up in the bottom 2/3 of my class, and then decided I wanted to stay, went back to law school, and in fact ended up in the top half of my class. I won the international moot court competition. I was the outstanding student in the political science department at the end of my year. I graduated with 3 degrees from undergraduate school and 165 credits, only needed 123 credits, and I'd be delighted to sit down and compare my IQ to yours if you'd like, Frank.
That was in Claremont, New Hampshire.
Yeah, that was near the end of the Biden for president campaign when reporters were starting to uncover, accusations of plagiarism, both in his campaign speeches and in his coursework in law school, misrepresentations about his grades, etc. And there you see Biden, full of bluster, with the cameras rolling. C-SPAN was there, and it was, I think, the first time an entire campaign event was filmed. And he, according to Connaughton, for 89 minutes, Biden was brilliant. And this is sort of Biden's story. He's a brilliant politician, but for that last minute when one person in the kitchen or wherever in New Hampshire said, didn't you inflate your grades, Biden lost it and started berating the man in a way that could only make him look like a bully and like a blowhard. And so there's this mix in Biden of real talent and an inability to control that side of him.
You quote, actually it's not a quote, but I'll read it from your book. The more money the sub-captains raised, the more access to Biden their captain received. Connaughton kept track of the contest and decided who got a lapel pin, who got dinner with the candidate. He also set up a system for contributors. If one of them wanted to see Biden, he needed to donate at least $1,000. Connaughton would tell the big-time donors, for $50,000, I can get you dinner with the senator at his house. For $25,000, I can get you dinner with the senator, but not at his house. That's in quotes. How much of this is new to the unwinding years you're talking about here? This access business?
Well, one thing that's relatively new is that there is a Jeff Connaughton out there who has the courage to tell in detail what really goes on between politicians and the people who raise money for them and the people who give them money. It's an incredibly detailed picture of a Washington in which, on the surface and in the media, there seems to be this tremendous polarization between left and right, but really they're joined by money and by the need to raise money and by the power of money to shape legislation, which is true for Democrats and Republicans. And I think Connaughton has honored himself by talking about the way it really works. And your question about how much is new, there's always been money in politics. Read Robert Caro on LBJ and how that corrupted him when he was in the House and Senate. I think what began in the late 70s and has gotten bigger and bigger since, that's the period of the book, is how systematic it now is, how it pervades everything, how there's no escape from it. Tom Harkin once said to me that a senator has to spend maybe 50% of his free time raising money. Just an astonishing, kind of week in, week out job alongside the job of being a senator, which is inevitably corrupting.
You also have this in this book, but if you, this is your conversation with Jeff Connaughton, but if you just worked your ass off for him for a few years, meaning Biden, he ignored you, intimidated you, sometimes humiliated you, took no interest in your advancement, and never learned your name.
That was Connaughton's experience, and according to him, it was the experience of others. It wasn't everyone's experience. There were people who bled Biden blue. That was the phrase, and it meant they were real loyalists. They were brought into the inner circle, and they remained loyal over the decades, and many of them are now in the White House because of that service and that tight relationship. Connaughton didn't get into that inner circle, and a lot of people didn't, and left Biden after a few years. He didn't create what Ted Kennedy created, which was a whole core of Biden guys who remained tight with him but went on to do other things because Kennedy realized that having someone in the White House and someone at Treasury and someone in the nonprofit world and someone in business was good for his ideas. And there wasn't that sense of creating like a new generation that would be, Biden's legacy.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in what is now called Silicon Valley, California. But back then it was not Silicon Valley. It was just the Santa Clara Valley.
To what kind of a family?
Academic. My parents were professors at Stanford. My mom is still alive. She's 88 and is a fiction writer. She writes short stories. My father died when I was 12. He was a law professor, and so I grew up in this, very bookish and very political household, while Stanford University, along with the rest of the campuses, was sort of blowing up in the late 60s. So I had, I was aware of bigger events and bigger issues from a young age.
How many children in the family?
I have a sister who's a novelist. She's a very successful novelist. She's a year and a half older than me. Her name is Ann Packer.
And your wife works for the New Yorker doing what?
My wife is a freelance journalist, Laura Secor. She is writing a book. I think it's going to be a tremendous book about Iran, about the origins of the reform and democracy movement in Iran, which has just had a very interesting resurgence with the election of a new president in that country. And she writes for the New Yorker from time to time from Iran.
And where'd you go to school?
Went to public school in Palo Alto just before Proposition 13, the tax revolt, passed in '78. Again, there's a lot of things in the book that happened around '78, which is why I began the book then. So I got out of the California public schools just in time before they became starved for funds. I went to Yale. That was the end of my formal education, but the rest of my education continues to this day.
How many years have you worked on this book? You talked about it, kind of getting the idea in 2006.
But I didn't really begin reporting until 2010 when I met Dean Price. And he was the way into the book. And then 2 years of return visits to North Carolina, return visits to Youngstown, many visits to Tampa, which is the scene of sort of the madness of the housing economy, which turned into the housing nightmare a few years ago. Visits to Silicon Valley. There's a lot about that big success story set off against some of these unhappier stories. That took 2 years and continued into 2012, but I had to start writing, and I wrote it very quickly. It took about 9 months in 2012, and it just about killed me.
How do you go about gathering your information when you're interviewing and sitting with others?
To write about these people in deep, intimate ways, about their past, their childhood, their work, their families, I had to spend a lot of time just hanging out with them, driving around, driving in Dean's beat-up old Honda as he went from county to county, driving in Tammy's Pontiac as she took me around her childhood on the east side of Youngstown, going out to dinner together. I stayed at Dean's house. So it wasn't a series of formal interviews so much as it was talking and letting the tape recorder roll and gradually filling out a picture of their life, not systematically, take me through your life from birth to the present. It had to be much more ad hoc and over a long period of time, and it took a lot of trust on both sides that this would not backfire, that it would work out for both of us.
When you're out there researching, who pays for that?
I paid for most of it because this was not a New Yorker project, this was a book. So I paid for my plane tickets to Tampa and to Greensboro. A couple of trips were part of New Yorker stories. Like the first time I met Dean Price, I was working on a New Yorker story, but most of it was out of my pocket.
But do you ever have a sense that you're spending more money than it's worth?
Yeah, and that I'm spending more time and effort. I mean, what is this all going to add up to? Am I going to get what I need? I remember coming home from Ohio once and telling Laura, my wife, I'm not getting her story. It's not going to work. And I went back and, kept talking to Tammy. And then I began to look at my transcripts once I had finished all the reporting, and I realized I actually have a lot. And then it becomes a creative process of shaping it into a narrative and into many narratives. This book, the real challenge was, how do I tell multiple stories, 3 or 4 main characters, Tampa, Silicon Valley, and then the 10 celebrity profiles? How do I organize them? I'll begin with Dean Price because I think he kind of is the beginning of the book, but then I'm going to break away from him and introduce Jeff Connaughton, Newt Gingrich, Tammy Thomas. How long can I stay away from Dean Price before the reader's going to start to forget about him? And then I need to bring him back in. There were all these structural problems. It was like solving a puzzle. It was fun to do, but it really challenged me to the limit to figure out a form, because there was no template for this other than a trilogy of novels published 80 years ago by John Dos Passos called USA, which is one of my favorite works of American literature, and which gave me an idea of how you create a kaleidoscopic portrait of America by weaving together all these different stories.
When did you write the preface?
Right at the end.
The reason I asked, I want to read the first paragraph. No one can say when the unwinding began, when the coil that held Americans together in its secure and sometimes stifling grip first gave way. Like any great change, the unwinding began at countless times, in countless ways, and at some moment the country, always the same country, crossed a line of history and became irretrievably different. What are the differences in your own life that you regret? In other words, what did you like in your early years that is gone now?
Yeah, and I wrote that after finishing the book, because the prologue, which is very short, is more like, it's like an overture. It just introduces the characters and some of the images of the book without telling you too much about what to think. I guess, I grew up in a very different California and in a different America. It was, in many ways less fair, less inclusive. If you were a Black American, you were disenfranchised to a large extent. If you were a woman, you were thwarted. If you were gay, you were non-existent. But there was this deal that if you worked hard and if you educated your children, there would be a place for you in society. Where I grew up, the public schools were really good. Everyone I knew went to one. The only kids who got sent to private school had screwed up in public school and were sort of being corrected in the private schools. There was wealth and there was poverty, but the extremes were not all that great. Silicon Valley hadn't yet created this super class of entrepreneurs, and homelessness was almost unheard of. So it was a more egalitarian place, a more egalitarian America. There was more security. There was more of a sense that, even if you're nobody, even if you just are holding down a job, there's some recognition that you're doing something valuable. You're not disposable. You're not to be discarded if we haven't heard of you or if you don't have a lot of money. And the America we live in today is a much more unequal and stratified place where it's very hard, if you're born in the wrong place, to move up. Harder than it was then. We think of ourselves as a very fluid society. We're actually less mobile than Europe is today. We're more stratified. We're more of a class society, which is a real loss, because that mobility is what has always justified our freewheeling capitalism. Now we have freewheeling capitalism, but people are stuck in place to a large extent. So I regret the passing of a lot of those things.
You start with the year 1978 in your book, and you list 9 different years where you put little headlines in there to describe the years. In your opinion, what are the major happenings that have changed us in the last 30, 40 years?
And they're not single events necessarily, but deindustrialization, the loss of blue-collar jobs, which has laid waste to a lot of cities and towns around the country.
Brought along because of what?
Global competition, technological change, the outsourcing and offshoring, and the willingness of companies to do it. Because Germany has lived in the same age of globalization without losing its manufacturing base, without sort of undermining the standard of living of its middle class, because they made some policy decisions to hold on to some of those jobs. And we have allowed it to happen in a much more sort of open way, which means some people have gotten very wealthy, especially through financial services.
What impact did Vietnam have on us?
I think it just undermined trust in government. And
What
so
impact
did
did Watergate have on us?
The same.
Now, you originally supported the Iraq War.
Yes.
Are you still glad you did?
That's impossible. I mean, I spent enough time there and saw enough of it and know enough about it to think that that war was a disaster for us and maybe for the Iraqis. You know, right now things look very grim. Iraq is returning to something close to civil war, partly because of the spillover from Syria. So anyone who wants to point, you know, to any gain beyond the ridding of the world from the world of Saddam Hussein, it's almost impossible to say that there is a gain.
I don't know if this is a fair question, but in your book, of all the things you write about and all the characters you write about, which one had the biggest impact on you?
I think Dean and Tammy, both from, you know, tougher backgrounds than I had, both faced greater obstacles than I did, and both have, far from quitting, have kind of kept coming back in new ways and found new ways to remake their lives just when it seemed as if everything was turning dark. I mean, Tammy's fiance was shot and killed. She lost most of her pension just before retirement. She, you know, faced all kinds of economic adversity. Dean's father committed suicide after being a sort of failed fire and brimstone preacher. And Dean went bankrupt, as I said, and yet they both still remain invested in the American dream, whether or not it remains invested in them. And that's the question the book raises. Is there still a place in America for people like that?
Would you use the word exceptional and apply that to the United States?
I might have once, but I think we need to come to a more modest appraisal of ourselves and our place in the world. I think what we're living through now is a trimming of our sails, a scaling down of our power and influence around the world. And what we really need is to create a better society here. We expended all this wealth and power abroad in Iraq and Afghanistan while hollowing out here at home. While our institutions were getting sick and declining, and our middle class, which is the basis of our democracy, was struggling. And in a lot of places I've been, including where Dean lives, where Tammy lives, people will say there is no more middle class. There's just rich and poor. And that's not an America I want to live in.
Our guest has been George Packer, and his book is called The Unwinding, An Inner History of the New America. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
for a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at Q&A.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.